The first thing I remember is the sound of the ocean swallowing everything around me, a deep roaring sound that seemed louder than anything I had ever heard before, and even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear it in my head, because that was the moment when my old life ended and the fight to survive began. But before I woke up on that beach, before I opened my eyes and found myself surrounded by nothing but sand, trees, and endless blue water, there had been a journey that had started like any other journey, and if someone had told me that by the end of that day I would be stranded on an unknown island with no food, almost no useful equipment, no way to call anyone, and absolutely no idea when I would see home again, I would have laughed at them, because when I stepped onto that ship, I was thinking about the destination, not survival. I remember the morning clearly. The sky had been cloudy, but nothing about it seemed unusual. The sea was restless, but not dangerous, and the wind was strong enough to make the ship move gently from side to side. I had spent some time looking out over the water, watching the waves disappear beneath the ship. Wondering how something as huge as the ocean could possibly have an end. There was something peaceful about it at the time, something almost hypnotic, and I remember thinking that I would probably remember that view for the rest of my life. I just didn't know then that I would remember it for a completely different reason, because several hours later the weather changed so quickly that none of us had enough time to understand what was happening. The clouds became darker, the wind became stronger, and the waves started rising higher and higher. At first, nobody seemed too worried. People continued moving around the ship, checking equipment and securing anything that could move. But then the first massive wave struck the side of the vessel and the entire ship shook, and suddenly everyone realized that this was no ordinary change in weather. I remember grabbing onto a metal railing as the deck tilted beneath my feet, hearing people shouting instructions over the wind, hearing objects crashing somewhere behind me, and feeling rain hit my face so hard that it felt like tiny pieces of ice. I tried to make my way toward a safer part of the ship, but every step became harder as the waves pushed against us. The ship climbed one enormous wave and then dropped into the space between two others, and for a few seconds it felt like we were falling through the ocean. I remember looking at the people around me and seeing fear on their faces, and that was the moment when I understood that we were in serious trouble. Another wave crashed over the deck, water rushed everywhere, and I lost my grip for a second. I grabbed the railing again with both hands, but something struck me from behind, and I was thrown sideways. My shoulder hit the deck, and everything became confused. There were alarms, shouting, wind, rain, and the sound of metal twisting under pressure. Someone yelled that we needed to move, but I couldn't even tell where the voice was coming from. I tried to stand and immediately slipped. Then another wave came, much larger than the ones before it, and when it hit the ship, I felt the entire world move beneath me. I remember seeing a section of the ship break apart. I remember reaching for something, anything, but my fingers closed around nothing, and then I was in the water. The cold hit me so hard that I couldn't breathe properly. The ocean pulled me downward, and I had no idea which direction was up. I opened my eyes, but could barely see anything because the water was full of bubbles and debris. I tried to swim toward the surface, but another wave pushed me down, and for a moment I thought I was never going to come back up. Then somehow I felt myself rising. My head broke through the surface, and I took a breath, but instead of air I almost swallowed water. I coughed, fought against the waves, and tried to keep my head above the surface. Pieces of wood and metal were floating around me, but the ship itself was already disappearing into the darkness. I tried shouting for help, but the wind carried my voice away. I couldn't see anyone, and I couldn't even tell if anyone else had survived. I remember grabbing onto a large piece of floating debris and holding it against my chest, because I knew I wouldn't be able to swim forever. The storm continued for what felt like hours, although later I realized it probably wasn't that long. But when you're fighting to stay alive, time stops making sense. Every wave felt like it could be the last. Every breath felt like something I had to earn, and every time I closed my eyes, I wondered whether I would open them again. Eventually the storm began moving away. The wind weakened slightly. The waves became smaller, and darkness started turning into the pale light of morning. I was exhausted beyond anything I had ever experienced. My arms barely worked, my legs felt like they belonged to someone else, and my hands were numb from holding onto the debris. But then I saw something in the distance. At first, I thought it was another piece of wreckage, but as I got closer, I realized it was land. I couldn't believe it. I stared at the dark shape on the horizon and forced myself to keep moving. Every stroke hurt, but the thought of reaching land gave me strength. I didn't know what was waiting for me there. I didn't even know if it was an island or just some strange rock formation, but at that moment I didn't care. I only knew that land meant I might survive. The current carried me closer and closer. Waves pushed me toward the shoreline, and eventually my feet touched something solid beneath the water. I tried to stand but almost collapsed. Another wave pushed me forward, then another, until finally my body was dragged onto wet sand. I crawled away from the water and collapsed, completely exhausted. And that was how I spent the first few moments on the island, face down in the sand, unable to move, unable to think, and unsure whether I had actually survived or whether this was some strange dream. When I finally opened my eyes, the storm was gone, the sky was bright, and the ocean looked almost peaceful, which somehow made everything feel even stranger. Because just hours earlier, that same ocean had nearly killed me. I slowly lifted my head and looked around. There was no ship, no crew, no rescue boat, no buildings, no roads, no people. Nothing except a long stretch of beach and a wall of thick green vegetation behind it. I tried to call out, but my voice was weak. I shouted anyway, hoping someone might answer. "Is anyone there?" Nothing, I shouted again, louder this time. "Help!" The only answer was the sound of waves breaking against the shore. And that was the first moment when fear truly entered my mind, because until then I had been focused on getting out of the water, but now I had to face the reality of where I was. I was alone. I didn't know where the ship had gone. I didn't know if anyone else had survived. I didn't know where this island was. And most importantly, I had no idea whether anyone knew that I was alive. I checked my pockets and discovered that almost everything I had carried was gone. My phone was missing. My wallet was gone. Anything that could have helped me contact the outside world had disappeared. I searched the sand around me anyway, crawling through the wet shoreline and looking between rocks. But I found nothing useful. Eventually I stood up, although my legs were shaking badly, and I looked toward the ocean, hoping to see some kind of rescue vessel, but the horizon was completely empty. I looked in the other direction and saw only jungle, tall trees with thick leaves, vines hanging from branches, and vegetation so dense that I couldn't see what was hidden behind the first few meters. I had no idea what kind of animals lived there. No idea whether there were dangerous insects. No idea whether there were cliffs or swamps or anything else that could hurt me. And suddenly the island didn't look beautiful anymore. It looked enormous, and I looked very small. My throat was painfully dry, my stomach was empty, and my clothes were still wet, so I knew I couldn't simply stand there waiting for rescue. I needed to find water. That became my first priority. I remembered that drinking seawater would only make dehydration worse. So I started walking along the beach, looking for any sign of fresh water. I checked behind rocks, near trees, and around small depressions in the ground, but I found nothing. The sun climbed higher, and with every passing minute my thirst became stronger. My lips felt dry, my tongue felt heavy, and I began thinking about water constantly. Eventually I noticed a line of darker vegetation leading away from the beach, and I wondered whether it could mean there was water somewhere inside the island. I had no better option, so I entered the jungle. The moment I stepped beneath the trees, the world changed. The heat from the sun disappeared behind layers of leaves. The air became humid, and suddenly I could hear hundreds of sounds that I hadn't noticed from the beach. Insects buzzed around me, birds called from somewhere above, branches moved in the wind, and every few seconds I heard something moving through the vegetation. I stopped several times because I couldn't tell whether the sounds were coming from harmless animals or something I should be afraid of. But thirst kept pushing me forward. I looked carefully at the ground as I walked, searching for wet soil, small streams, footprints, or anything that might lead me to water. Then after what felt like forever, I heard something, a faint rushing sound. I stopped completely and listened. There it was again, water. I pushed through the vegetation and suddenly found a narrow stream flowing between rocks. I dropped to my knees and stared at it for a moment because I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing. I put my hands into the water and felt the coldness against my skin. Then I drank, slowly at first, then more quickly, and the feeling was incredible. I had never appreciated water before that moment, not when I could turn on a tap at home, not when I could buy a bottle from a store, not when water was always available. But sitting there alone beside that stream, I understood that water wasn't something to take for granted. It was the difference between surviving and not surviving. After drinking, I rested beside the stream and looked around. I began thinking about food, because finding water had solved one problem, but created another question. How long could I go without eating? I had no idea what plants were safe, so I didn't want to take unnecessary risks. I searched along the stream and noticed small fish moving through the shallow water. I tried catching one with my hands, but they were too fast. Every time I reached toward them, they disappeared. I tried using a stick, but I had no idea what I was doing. Eventually, I became frustrated and sat beside the water, staring at the fish as they moved through the stream. I realized that surviving here would require patience. I couldn't expect everything to happen immediately, so I decided to explore carefully. I followed the stream for a while and found several areas where the trees were thinner. Then I noticed something that gave me another idea. There were fallen branches and pieces of wood everywhere. If I was going to survive the night, I needed shelter. The thought of sleeping in the open made me nervous, especially because I didn't know what might come out of the jungle after dark. So I collected branches and carried them back toward the beach. It took several trips, and every trip left me more exhausted. But I kept going. I chose a location slightly above the shoreline, close enough to the beach that I could see the ocean, but far enough away that the tide couldn't reach me. Then I started building. I leaned long branches against a fallen tree and covered them with leaves, vines, and smaller branches. The structure looked terrible, and several times it collapsed completely, but I refused to stop. I rebuilt it again and again until I finally had something that looked like a small shelter. It wasn't comfortable, but it could protect me from rain and wind, and at that point, that was enough. After building the shelter, I returned to the stream. Determined to find food before sunset, I sharpened a stick against a rock and tried again to catch fish. I waited quietly beside the water, watching the movement beneath the surface, and after several failed attempts, I finally managed to strike one. I pulled it from the water and stared at it. It was small, much smaller than I wanted. But it was food, and I knew I couldn't waste it. I carried it back to the beach and began preparing a fire. This was another challenge I hadn't expected. Making a fire without proper equipment was much harder than it looked. I tried rubbing dry wood together, but nothing happened. I tried using small pieces of bark and dry grass, but the wind kept destroying the tiny flame before it could grow. I almost gave up, but eventually a small spark caught. I carefully protected it with my hands and slowly added dry material. The flame grew, and for the first time since the shipwreck, I felt a small sense of control. I cooked the fish over the fire and ate it slowly. Every bite felt important, and although it wasn't enough to make me full, it gave me enough energy to continue. I drank more water from the stream and then returned to the beach, where I began thinking about rescue. I needed some way to make myself visible, so I gathered pieces of wood and arranged them across the sand in a large signal pattern, something that could hopefully be seen from above. Then I collected more dry wood and created a larger fire, because smoke could potentially attract attention. As the afternoon continued, I kept looking toward the horizon, hoping to see a ship or aircraft, but nothing appeared. The island remained completely silent except for the waves and birds, and slowly the sun began moving lower. I realized that I had spent almost the entire day surviving one problem after another, but night was going to bring a completely different kind of fear. During daylight, I could see the jungle. I could see the beach. I could see the ocean, but at night all of that would disappear into darkness. I made sure the fire was burning well and gathered enough wood to keep it alive for several hours. Then I checked my shelter again, strengthening the sides with more branches, adding leaves to the roof and creating a small sleeping area from dry vegetation. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to relax. I kept thinking about the possibility of another storm. I kept wondering whether animals would approach the shelter, and I couldn't stop thinking about home. I imagined what people would be doing right now. Whether anyone had received news about the ship, whether anyone was searching for survivors, whether my disappearance had even been discovered yet. The thought made my chest feel heavy, because there was no way for me to know. I had no phone, no radio, no map, and no idea where I was. I walked to the edge of the water one last time before darkness arrived and stared toward the horizon. The ocean looked endless, and somewhere beyond it was everything I knew, but between me and that world was an enormous distance. I had no boat, no engine, no navigation equipment, and no idea which direction would lead me home, so I understood that leaving the island by myself wasn't realistic. My best chance was to stay alive and make myself visible, then wait for rescue. But waiting was going to be harder than I expected. When darkness finally arrived, the island transformed. The jungle became a massive black wall, and sounds came from places I couldn't see. Something moved through the leaves near my shelter. I froze, listening carefully. Then the sound stopped. A few minutes later, I heard another noise farther away. then another. I grabbed the metal piece I had recovered from the wreck and kept it beside me. Even though I knew it wouldn't protect me from anything serious, simply having it nearby made me feel slightly less helpless. I sat beside the fire and watched the flames, trying to keep my thoughts under control. Every time the fire became smaller, I added another piece of wood, because I didn't want to sit in complete darkness. The heat from the flames helped with the cold night air, and the light made the shelter feel a little safer. I looked up and saw stars covering the sky, more stars than I had ever seen in my life. Without city lights or buildings blocking the view, the entire sky seemed enormous, and for a few minutes I forgot that I was stranded. I just watched the stars and listened to the ocean, but then reality returned, because I remembered that I had no idea how many nights I would have to spend there. One night was already difficult, but what about 2, 5, 10, or more? What if the rescue teams didn't know where the ship had gone? What if they searched the wrong area? What if they assumed there were no survivors? Those thoughts terrified me, but I knew I couldn't let them control me, because fear could make me careless, and carelessness could get me killed. So I started thinking about the next morning instead. I would need more food. I would need to make my shelter stronger. I would need to explore the island carefully. I would need to find out whether there were coconuts or other safe sources of food. I would need to search the beach for more wreckage, because anything from the ship could become useful, and I would need to improve my rescue signal. Those thoughts gave me something to focus on, and eventually I crawled into my shelter, lying down on the hard ground, listening to the waves outside. I tried to sleep, but every strange sound woke me. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps, sometimes branches breaking, sometimes distant cries from birds, and once I heard something splash in the stream. I stayed completely still until the sound disappeared. My body wanted sleep, but my mind kept telling me to stay awake. Eventually, exhaustion became stronger than fear, and I closed my eyes, not knowing what the next day would bring. Before falling asleep, I thought about how quickly everything had changed. That morning, I had been on a ship, surrounded by people and equipment, believing that I knew where my life was going, and now I was lying under a shelter, made from branches and leaves on an island, whose name I didn't even know. I had no idea whether anyone would find me. I had no idea how long I could survive, and I had no idea what dangers were waiting beyond the beach. But despite everything, there was one thing I still had, and that was the decision to keep going. Because the first day had taught me that survival wasn't about being fearless. It wasn't about being strong every second. And it wasn't about knowing exactly what to do. Survival was about solving one problem at a time. When I was thirsty, I searched for water. When I was hungry, I searched for food. When night came, I built shelter. When fear appeared, I made myself focus on the next task. And when I thought about giving up, I reminded myself that someone might still be searching for me. I reminded myself that the ocean had already taken almost everything from me, but it had not taken my life. And as long as I was alive, there was still a possibility that I could return home. So I whispered to myself in the darkness, "I'm still here." And then I listened to the waves, slowly breathing in and out, while the fire burned beside my shelter. And somewhere beyond the darkness, beyond the jungle, beyond the endless ocean, was the world I wanted to see again. I didn't know when that moment would come, but I promised myself that if morning came, I would wake up and fight for another day, because my first day on the island was over, but my survival story had only just begun.